Hey all, in this video, we are going to start macroeconomics. And so if you notice, we are gonna, in particular, start from unit 2. The reason why you're not gonna see a video playlist on unit 1 for macro is because we already went over all the concepts in micro, right? Unit 1 of macro looks at supply and demand. It looks at comparative and absolute advantage. It looks at the PPC, which yet again are all things that we already covered. So to save a little bit of time, we are starting from unit 2. In this video in particular, we are going to look at what exactly is macroeconomics, and we're going to start to dive into GDP. What exactly is it? Right? What are the characteristics of our gross domestic product? And lastly, how do we calculate our GDP? All right. Let's go. So what exactly is macro? And so in micro, we looked at sort of the minute details, right? The individual supply, the individual demand of consumers or businesses. Well, in macro, we're looking at the large economy as a whole. So in other words, we're looking at the big picture. So basically, instead of analyzing just one consumer, we are analyzing all the consumers. Instead of looking at one business, we're looking at all the businesses. So a better way to describe macro is essentially we're looking at countries and all the business that make up a market, all the consumers that make up, that also make up a market, and we're studying them as a collective whole. And so just a brief history, the field of macroeconomics was really born during the Great Depression. And the reason for that was because the government didn't really understand how to fix an economy that had a quarter of its population being unemployed. And so they basically created macroeconomic theory from that. And so the reason why we have this field of macroeconomics is twofold. One, to measure the health of the whole economy. Is our economy doing well? Yes or no? And we know that through the study of macroeconomics. Secondly, is to guide policies to fix these problems, right? So we first identify these problems, and then there are solutions to fix the problems that were identified. And so one of the first fields within macroeconomics that we're going to study is going to be the study of the GDP. And so before we get into GDP itself, we first have to go over, well, what are economic goals? And so every single country in the world has 3 economic goals, or more specifically, has 3 macroeconomic goals. The first being to promote economic growth, right? You want to see your country's economy grow and grow and grow over time. There logically shouldn't be a country that wants to see its economy in a recession, right? Or in a depression. Number 2, they want to limit unemployment. No country wants to have 50% of its citizens being unemployed, right? So countries, one of their 3 economic goals is to limit the amount of people that are unemployed. And lastly is to limit inflation, or in other words, to keep prices stable. You don't want to go to the grocery store one day and buy a carton of milk for $2 and then go into a grocery store a week later and have the same carton of milk be $15, right? That's just outrageous. And so the third macroeconomic goal is to keep prices stable. And so how do we exactly measure economic growth? Well, it's through something called national income accounting. Basically, what that is when economists collect all these numbers, all this data on production, income, investments, and savings. And so when economists add all that together, we're going to say they can use that data, they can use those raw numbers to calculate how much our economy grew from point A to point B, or from year X to year Y. And so the most important measure of growth is through GDP. And so if you didn't know what GDP is something called gross domestic product, right? And we see this right here, gross domestic product. And the definition of it is what's here on the screen, the dollar value of all the final goods and services within a country in a single year. There's a reason why I already had this definition, or parts of it already highlighted for us. It's because these are the key portions of this definition, right? So GDP is measured, right, through the dollar value. It's measured in dollars. Through final goods and services, right, within a specific country, and it only tracks for one specific year. And that's exactly what this slide is trying to tell us. And so when I talk about dollar value, we're going to say our GDP is measured in US dollars. When I'm talking about final goods, it only counts new goods and services. So used goods, so if you buy a used car, or if you go thrift shopping at Goodwill or places like that, you technically are not contributing to the United States GDP. Third, within a country, it measures production within the country's borders. Right? So if something is created and sold in a different country, well, that product does not count towards that original country's GDP. And lastly, 1 year, right? It's an annual economic performance, a measure of an annual economic performance, meaning, right, it is only a single year. And so what exactly does it tell us? Well, it measures how well a country is doing financially. Should it be taken as gospel? No, right? There's so much more out there to measure how well a country is doing than just the GDP. However, it is a pretty reliable measure of how well a country is doing financially here. And so there are 3 ways we can use GDP. 1, compare it to previous years. So we can look at the 2020 GDP in the United States and compare it to the 1993 GDP of the United States. And we can say, was there economic growth or not? We can compare policy changes, right? So we can compare President Trump's policies to President Obama's policies and see, which policy made a much more of an impact on GDP? And lastly, we can compare ourselves to other countries, right? Is the United States comparatively better off or relatively better off, right, than South Korea? And we could use the GDP to help us determine, right, if we're better off here. And so how can you measure growth from year to year? And so this is going to be our first equation, right? Macro is a pretty sort of math and equation heavy sort of economic sort of field. And so we can measure growth through this equation. The percent change in GDP, right, equals year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1, and then we're going to multiply it by 100. And so a couple key things to note through this equation, right? Percent change in GDP equals year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 times 100. Is that this year 2 and year 1, they can be any years, right? It doesn't have to be subsequent years, right? It doesn't have to be 2018 to 2019. We can compare, like I said earlier, 2019 to 1939. We compare 1960 to 2015, right? So it's just the second year, right, minus the first year over the first year times 100 gets us to that percent change. And that's the reason why we multiply this by 100 to get us to that percentage mark. So let's do a little bit of an example before we move on, right? So we're going to say Kim Lian's GDP in 2018 was $2,000. Well, we're also going to say that Kim Lian's GDP in 2020, right, was $2,100 here. Well, here we know what our equation is, right? Our equation is the percent change in GDP equals year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 times 100. That is our percent change. Well, here, right? Well, what exactly is the percent change in GDP? That is what the question is asked for. So let's figure this out. So our percent change in GDP is going to equal, well, what's the second year? Well, the first year is 2018, right? Because that happened in the past. So our current year, year 2, is going to be 2020. So year 2, right, is 2,100, right? And we're going to subtract the year 1 GDP, which is 2,000. And then here, what we're going to do is we're going to divide that by our year 1 GDP, which is $2,000. And then remember, because we're trying to figure out the percent change, we're going to multiply all this by 100. And so now what we get to is we're going to get to 100 divided by 2,000, right, times 100. And then here, right, we can boil this down to, right, 1 over 20, right, times 100, which inevitably gets us to 5%. So from 2018 to 2020, there was a 5% growth in GDP. And so total GDP is something different than GDP growth, right? If we're looking at at the end of the day, the total GDP of a country, we're talking about different terms than whenever we talk about something called GDP growth here. And so the second question is, well, does GDP accurately measure standard of living? By looking at a country's GDP, can we determine if that country is well off, or if the citizens living in that country is well off or not? Well, technically we can, yes. However, we need to fiddle around with our equation, or we need to fiddle around with the GDP to take into account the size of the nation's population, right? Because if you just look at the United States GDP and compare it to South Korea's GDP, those are two very different countries in terms of population, in terms of population, right? And so to accurately measure standard of living, we're going to look at something called GDP per capita. And so GDP per capita is the best measure of a nation's standard of living. The higher the GDP per capita, we are going to say the better off the citizens of that country are. And so the number that we get at the end of the day, it identifies on average how many dollars worth of products each individual citizen makes. And so how we get to this, right? So the equation to get to GDP per capita, right? So GDP per capita. Remember, per capita just means per person, right? So GDP per capita, we can rephrase that to say GDP per person. That equals, right, our GDP divided by the population. And that gets us to our GDP per capita. Right? So an example. So let's say the GDP for Kimland was $1 in 2020. And let's say there's only one person living in Kimland. Well, that means the GDP per capita is just a single dollar. And so we're going to say that individual living in Kimland is not really well off, right? Because a GDP per capita equating to only $1 is not that great. And so why do some countries have higher GDP than others? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, the 5 reasons you see on the screen, but we can boil it down to a single word: productivity. If a nation is more productive, we are going to say that nation theoretically should have a higher GDP per capita, should have a higher GDP comparatively to other nations around the world. And so you can't just say productivity, right? So the 5 things we'll go over real quick. Economic system should be something that you guys know already. So think of like the free market, the mixed economy, or a communist economy, command economy. Rule of law, right? All rule of law is basically saying is if the country is stable, right? Are there laws in place that protect its citizens? Capital stock, right? Remember, capital stock are goods that produce other goods. So is a nation investing and producing these capital goods? Human capital, right? So you're investing in education and stuff like that. And lastly, natural resources, right? Some countries have higher GDPs because they have a better access to natural resources compared to other countries. So we talked about GDP, right? But what we didn't talk about is, well, what doesn't go into GDP, right? Because we talked about, right, that GDP is the dollar value of all the final goods and services within a country in a single given year. Well, there are 3 things that are not included in our GDP. The first are intermediate goods. And what I mean by intermediate goods are these are goods that produce other goods, or goods that are used to produce other goods. So if we're looking at a new car, let's say you have a 2021 Nissan. So the new 2021 Nissan, when it's sold, counts towards the nation's GDP. However, right? The rubber used to produce the tires, the glass used as the windshield, the steel used as the frame of the car. All those resources that were used to produce the final 2021 Nissan are considered to be intermediate goods and are not considered to be in part of the GDP itself. So it's not included in the calculation of the GDP. Number 2, non-production transactions. In other words, right, these are financial transactions or used goods. So things like selling a bond or selling a stock or receiving interest. That stuff is non-production transaction. And so that is not included in the GDP. It's a quick thing to note here with non-production transaction. So the selling of the bond, the selling of the stock are not included. However, if a stock trader earns a commission, right, that commission is included as a part of the GDP, right? Because they're receiving it as sort of revenue and they're theoretically going to spend it, right? So the commission is considered to be a part of it, but not necessarily the actual sale or the transition of the ownership of a bond from person A to person B. That is not included in the GDP. And lastly, non-market and illegal activities. I think illegal activities should make sense as to why it's not considered to be a part of the GDP, but non-market, in other words, things that are produced inside your household, right? So here, if you're doing a bake sale and you decide to bake all the goods yourself, that is not considered to be a part of the GDP. Right. So now that we went over all this, right, the next thing is, well, how do we calculate GDP? How do we calculate GDP? So there are really 3 different ways how we calculate GDP. The biggest way, the way that you need to know, is going to be the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach is just you add up the spending on all the final goods and services produced within a given year. So in other words, just basically you're doing accounting, right? You're an accountant and you look at everything, all the final goods that were sold, right, in a single year, all the services that were sold in a single year, and you say, well, add it up together, that is the expenditure approach. The final number should be the GDP. The second is the income approach. The income approach is just add up all the income from selling the goods, right? So number 1 and 2, the expenditure and income approach, are very closely tied together, right? These two should, at the end of the day, add up to the same exact number. And lastly is value added. That's, you don't necessarily need to know that, so we're not really going to go over it. But at the end of the day, no matter which way you calculate GDP, you should get to the same number, right? So if you use the expenditure approach, the income approach, or the value added approach, you're going to get to the same exact calculation of the GDP at the end of the day. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into the expenditure approach. So when we use the expenditure approach, there are 4 different components that make up GDP here. So it's consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and net exports. And so when we talk about investment, before we move on, typically when we picture investment, we picture like you're buying stocks and bonds, right? You're buying a share of a company. But when we're calculating GDP, we are not really looking at the investment of stocks and bonds, but instead we're looking at the investment in capital goods. We're looking at the investment in goods that produce other goods here. So that's just a quick note. So we can just use a simple equation here, right? So these 4 components right here all add up to give us our GDP number. So our GDP, which we could label as Y, is going to equal our consumer spending, which is C, plus our business investment, which is I, plus our government spending, which is G, plus exports, which is X, minus imports, which is M. Or, right, X minus M, we could just do it as X subset N, right? So GDP equals C plus I plus G plus XN. In other words, GDP equals consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports, which net exports just your exports minus your imports here. All right, so I want you guys to take a minute, look at this, and tell me, what exactly is the GDP here, right? So in this table, what is included in your GDP and what isn't, and then add up all the numbers together to calculate the total GDP for the United States here. All right, so now we're back, right? So what is included? Well, is this first thing, $10 for movie tickets, included in our GDP? Well, yes, it is. It is included in our GDP, right? Because it's consumer spending. Is the $5 million increase in defense expenditures included in our GDP? Well, yes, it is, right? It's government spending. Is $45 for used economic textbooks included? Well, no, right? Because it's used. And so remember, used stuff is not included in this current GDP. Ford makes a $2 million factory. Well, yes, right, that is going to be investment spending. We can consider factories to be capital goods, right? A $20,000 Toyota made and sold in Mexico. Well, that is not a part of the US GDP, right? Because it was made and sold in a different country. And because of that, right, this is not included within our GDP here. Profit made from selling stocks? Well, yet again, no, right? Because the selling stocks and bonds is not included, right? That is a non-production transaction. $15,000 made in the United States but sold in Canada? Well, yes, that is included in our GDP. So although sold in Canada, it was made in the United States, right? And because of that, right, we're going to consider this to be net exports. It's made in the United States, and then we are exporting it to Canada to be sold. A $10,000 tuition to attend college, that is also part of our GDP, right? Tuition can be considered to be a part of consumer spending. Social Security payments is not, right? That is considered to be a non-production transaction. And then lastly, the farmer purchased a new $100,000 tractor. Well, yes, right? You consider that to be consumer spending. Personally, I would say that's more investment spending because that tractor theoretically is going to be used to produce other goods on the farm there, right? And so at the end of the day, if we add these all up, right, you should get to the number of $7,125,010. All right. And so the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is just going to be, well, a practice FRQ. A practice FRQ. So what I want you guys to do is just pause the video real quick. Try to do these 4 things yourself. Is it counted in the 2006 GDP or not? And explain. All right, so pause the video now, and then we'll come back and go over it together. So let's go over it now. So here, right, if we're looking at this FRQ, it's saying indicate whether each of the following is counted in the United States gross domestic product for the year of 2006. Explain each of your answers. And so remember, when you're looking at FRQ and it asks you to explain, you need to include a 1 to 2 sentence explanation as to why your answer is correct. So it's not just enough to say yes or no. You have to say yes or no because. So whenever you see the word explain, you should include that connecting word because there. Okay. So let's look at this first one. The value of a used textbook sold through an online auction in 2006. Well, this is not included, right, in the 2006 GDP. And so the reason why this is not included in the 2006 GDP is because it's a used item. The used item was already counted towards whatever year's GDP that it was a new item. So for example, if this used textbook was a new textbook in the year 2000, well, that means, right, that this new textbook was counted towards the 2000 GDP. We can't double dip and say it counts for the 2000 GDP and it also counts towards the 2006 GDP. So it's only going to count when it is a new item. And so because it is used, it is not included in our 2006 GDP here. Second, rent paid in 2006 by residents in an apartment building built in 2000. So here, College Board is getting a little bit tricky. The answer for this is yes, right? This is included in the 2006 GDP. How college board tried to trick you in this question was they looked at, right, the apartment building built in 2000. So although the building itself was built in 2000, the rent is considered to be a service provided in the current year of 2006. Remember, if we go back to our definition of GDP, GDP is the total products that are sold, right, of goods and services, right? So if you provide a service, that is considered to be part of the GDP. C, commissions earned in 2006 by a stockholder. So I think a lot of you are going to put no here, but the correct answer is yes, right? This is included in the GDP. If the question said the sale of a bond or the sale of a stock in 2006, then you're right. This would not count towards the GDP. The reason why commissions are counted towards the GDP is because, right, the commissions represent income for providing a service in the current year of 2006. Right? So it's income generated by providing a service to someone else. And because of that, this commission is considered to be a part of the 2006 GDP. Lastly, D, the value of automobiles produced in 2006 in South Korea by a firm fully owned by U.S. citizens. So the answer to this is no. This is not included in the GDP, even though, right, the firm is fully owned by U.S. citizens. The reason why this is not included in the GDP is because the GDP does not include production outside of the given country. So if this whole scenario, this whole FRQ is looking at the United States GDP, because the automobiles are produced entirely in South Korea, right? It does not count towards the United States GDP, right? The US GDP does not include production outside of the United States itself. All right, so hopefully that all made sense. I hope you guys learned a lot from this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.